autotelic foundry.
Thank you, everybody. It's great to be here. Thanks so much, Nadim. Thanks to the festival. Thanks to Spike for the invitation as well. Great to be here. It's been a long time since I was in Vienna. And I just thought I'd start by giving a little bit of additional context and background of things I'm going to talk about, because I'm kind of new around here. I drift from scene to scene and place to place. All right, but I'll start with a short poetic refrain. Is the volume okay? Is it okay? Can you hear me at the back? It's all right? Okay. Fractals don't care about your feelings. Systems disregard their externalities. And formalisms cannot reason about the real. Excuse me. So, a few things that I've done. I guess the reason I'm here is that a few years ago, in the peak of the NFT mania, if anybody remembers that far back, Spike Art magazine made a special edition on Web3 technologies, and I wrote the essay in that, and it was called "The Revolution Will Not Be Tokenized." And just bear in mind, this was at the peak of the NFT hype, and these were words that people did not want to see in that order published in print. But I would say that the article aged pretty well, and I don't see many people talking about NFTs now, unless they're kind of grave diggers or epitaph writers. Okay. Anyway, as Nadim mentioned, yeah, I come a bit more from scholarly kind of academic background, and I've been founding and editing peer-reviewed research journals for the last few years, including one at the space of the MIT Media Lab called Cryptoeconomic Systems, and that was an interdisciplinary research journal that was trying to bring together people from all kinds of different fields, so everything from mathematics to policy, economics, cryptography, distributed systems, all the rest of it, to kind of mint a new field around blockchain technology, Web3, cryptocurrencies, which is something that I know a lot about, and I used to like a lot, and now I don't like at all, which I think that will become clear. Yeah, I think this is what we're going to do for the next 40 minutes, yeah. And yeah, also as Nadim said, these days I edit a law journal, also at the MIT Media Lab, and that's very funny because I know nothing about the law, like actually nothing. But I do know, and I study the governance of decentralized and headless systems, and that gestures towards a possible future of how computation and law might go together. Some of the work we're going to draw on a bit more today. So a couple of years ago, I wrote an article called Profit Motives and Network States, which is about the topic for today is this thing called network states, which we're going to get to in a minute. And I was comparing them to some things we saw in medieval Christendom, shall we say. I also write a little bit about time, especially on kind of new machinic forms of time. And I think that connects with some of the topics that we've been hearing about this weekend, last weekend. So for example, I've been looking at blockchains as time machines. It's like ways that things like new forms of technical substrates and objects that create their new forms of temporal logics that are divorced from the ones that we're used to, the sun and the calendar and the clock, and so on. And also spent a lot of time in the Bitcoin community. I used to organize the MIT Bitcoin Expo, for example, and I kind of turned against Bitcoin when I started to see the externalities, in particular the thermodynamic and ecological ones, stacking up much faster than the benefits. So I wrote this article called Necro-Primitivism Rising about all my old friends, and guess what? We're not friends anymore. And a very, very long time ago, I used to play with different kinds of technologies to create temporal regimes. And this is a ultra-fast laser spectrometer that I used to operate during my PhD at the UK's National Laser Facility. So I've been thinking about time for a very long time. Okay, I'll just say something quickly about the 0x Salon. I think that's kind of my primary connection to the milieu, the emerging milieu of digital culture. So it's basically like we just sat around a table at a workspace in Berlin called Trust 5 or 6 years ago, having these interdisciplinary conversations. And as this event series kind of wore on, it kind of became a bit more formal. Community formed around it. We started getting funding and invitations. We started making creative works, literary works, and all the rest of it. And now it's now. So I'm just going to give you a really quick taste of some of those things. So these are some of the topics we discussed, and it goes everywhere from abstraction, algorithms, the virus, memes, and so on. So basically we start from a specific point and we diverge out into various insolubilities or incongruities of digital culture, shall we say. And we're doing those in Berlin and London these days. I think the first creative project we made was in 2021, where we got some money from this thing called the Black Swan DAO in Berlin to make an unscripted radio play about technology governance, which you can listen to online. And a follow-up project, next year, the European Commission gave us some funding as part of their STARTS program. And we made a theatre production about Bitcoin, about proof of work boiling to oceans, which we performed for one night only in the art space next to that castle where Hamlet was from, which is quite a perverted form of punishment for how much Shakespeare we stole. We also made an interactive storytelling environment, kind of a choose your own misadventure game out of the same material. And we still go around performing that as kind of a game show, which is fun or stupid, depending on what you think. And most recently, we made a card deck called Foex Salon. And this is like a discursive roleplay game that kind of hybridizes between Magic the Gathering and Tarot. And the idea is that we put on the identities of these characters and explore bizarre, counterfactual discourses that would not be possible otherwise. I'm not going to read you this wall of text, but I thought I might show you some of the pictures. And some of these concepts in the cards will also come up as we go through the presentation. It could be that I don't know what the causal link is between what ends up on the cards and what ends up in my research. I think it's kind of connected. Okay, all right, more of that. Object-oriented Scientology, Rhizome Negrestani for any of the heads in the audience. Hildegard von Bingo. Okay, all right, enough of that. So this is the biographical slide. So that's me on the left, thinking I found a gap in the research, or like saying I found a gap in the research. But who knows if that gap is really there or not. And on the right is the kind of the question that I suppose most of my research has become about, which is around the human stories of technology. So there's this famous slide from a 1978 IBM presentation, which says, a computer can never be held accountable, therefore a computer must never make a management decision. And Joey Tribbiani seems relaxed about that. But now, in 2025, it seems that a computer can be management. And then we have all the implications and the worries of model collapses and all the rest of it. And I think Joey is right to look concerned in that particular case. Okay, so the project I want to talk to you about today it's called Ouster of Nations. I kind of adapted it slightly for this festival to be Collapse of Nations. And it's really about some emerging threats to the global polis, to the kind of the network of nation state, the global map and the way it's organized, the polities, the countries and the empires and all the rest of it. So I was in Brussels the other week. We went to the European Parliament. It's a very funny place to go. It's almost like a theme park. And they had this box there that I'm standing beside that says democracy in action. But they didn't put a very big space between the two words on the bottom. So it kind of looks like democracy in action. And, I worry that we're sleepwalking into what's coming next, which I'm going to elaborate in a moment. Okay, I'm going to read you some bits now, and hopefully this will give a kind of like an overview of the project, and then we're going to go into various kind of strands that I think are kind of knotted up in this topic. The emergence of techno-capitalist and neo-reactionary currents of thought, exemplified by the dark Enlightenment writings of Nick Land and Curtis Yarvin, presaged the ongoing anti-democratic turn in contemporary politics. These reactionary ideologies, framing monarchical governance, zones of exception, patchwork neo-feudalism, hyper-financialization, and ecological extractivism as desirable and/or inevitable outcomes of capitalist evolution, threaten to normalize anti-egalitarian logics under the guise of technological progress. So that sounds nice. And these ideas have been around for a while. To many of us in the room, it's nothing new. And we kind of went through these conversations before the pandemic, and they were interesting ideas, but they were kind of floating out in an abstract conceptual space. But the thing is, they're now being put into practice, and that's why this topic is quite important and relevant and urgent now. So there's an emboldened cadre of technology elites, most strikingly attempting to enact these ideas through the organizational concept of network states. And these are envisaged to be archipelagos of sovereign territorial enclaves, acting as de jure exits, de jure, like de-jurisdictions, shall we say, de jure exits from the oversight of traditional power structures, tax, regulation, and so on. And like one of the other moves that this project does under kind of a similar name, or like a derivative of it, is trying to trace the roots of this kind of neo-colonial, or like, let's say it's a new form of the old colonialism, shall we say, and tracing that back to where I think that its roots are in like the Western imaginary, which is the Crusades, the holy wars between Cross and Crescent, which started in the late 11th century. I won't talk too much about that today, but it's kind of peppered in the presentation. So by tracing the roots of technology colonialism to medieval crusader institutions and early modern India Company enterprises, Ouster of Nations explores the supremacist violence underlying libertarianism. So here's some questions for us to ponder as we go through. How do right-wing movements co-opt emancipatory utopian rhetorics, such as those of decentralization, freedom, and sovereignty, to legitimize and ultimately enact their patriarchal, colonial, and necro-political desires? What alternative governance practices or ethical frameworks might mitigate or counter these maneuvers to reorder the global polis? So these are the things I want to hold in our minds. And what I'm going to try and do is undergo this kind of psychopolitical reading of cults of personality, which so often form around these election-based democratic systems that we have today. Take a look at the world around you. We're kind of surrounded by strong men and reactionary movements. And so I'm looking for historical parallels or lessons from history that we might be able to bring into our present moment. And I found some of those in piratical governance, the way the pirates organize themselves, and the Athenian democracy, the Greek democracy, to provide dynamic and non-hegemonic selectioneering primitives for democracies resisting techno-capitalist hegemony. Those are a lot of long words, aren't they? Okay, well, hopefully that'll become a bit more clear. So I want to start by, it always starts with a dream, starts with a promise. And a couple of weeks ago, there was an event at the Barbican in London called Experiments in Utopia. And the image on the left is this very beautiful kind of concrete garden of the Barbican Conservatory. And on the right is the smoking area, which I actually think is also an example of a utopian enclosure. So, you know, you don't get to choose which utopia you get. There's the promise and there's the reality. So just keep those things in mind. And the longer that we delay delivering on the promise, the longer we delay turning the promise into a reality, the more we can kind of sucker people in and have them buy into the dreams that we're trying to sell. And that's nothing new, of course, but the stakes are quite high at the moment, which is why I think it's worth talking about. Okay, so we have this concept of utopia, which I'm sure, like, you know, we're probably actually a bit sick of by now. But it's always interesting to look at where these concepts come from. And so there was a book in the 16th century by Thomas More, a British writer. And this was a fictional socio-political satire about an island, an impossible island, and the kind of the customs that the people on the island would live around. And they were quite loosely, like quite tightly based on kind of monastic routines, which, you know, this is the 16th century, that was still a thing. But what's interesting, I think, is where the word came from. So ou is not or no in Greek, and topia, topos, is place. So this idea was that this is not a thing that we can get. This is something impossible, beyond reach, an ideal. But in Greek, we also have eu, EU, as in true, like eukaryote or something like that. And then so utopia slipped from being no place to good place, some place. So from something that we can't have to maybe it's something that we're allowed to imagine and promise and dream. And this kind of ambiguity was something also that More played on. And there's this quote from a later addendum of the book. "Wherefore not utopia, but rather rightly, my name is a utopia, a place of felicity." So it may also be that Thomas More also changed his mind in the process of indoctrinating himself, brainwashing himself about the idea of utopia. Okay, so this is what we were promised. And I think this is more likely what we're going to get. That's a real place, by the way, in British South Atlantic Ocean territory, Tristan da Cunha, inaccessible island. Who is the utopia for? I think, is a very good question to ask ourselves as we go forwards. So we had utopia, we had a utopia. We have like the kind of Web 2.0 version, the utopia. We might have some we-topias. We might have a mytopia. But just take the T out of mytopia and we end up with myopia, short-sightedness. And so like maybe there's something in there. And those were just some like shower thoughts towards an epistemology of communal insecurities I wrote at the bottom of the slide. I don't know what that means yet, but hopefully I'll find out. Okay, hopefully, I think the sound isn't working on this video, but like I want to give you a, where's the, here we go. Let's go. So this is a video we made, a short kind of cut video for the Black Hole of Money, this theater production we made about Bitcoin. And this is a Bitcoin gated community for Bitcoiners. So the idea is in the Bitcoin kind of fantasy, as the price of Bitcoin keeps going up, this alienates the two groups of people, the people that have it and the people that don't. So eventually the Bitcoiners want to move to these secure citadels. They want to leave society and go live in castles with the other people that get them, i.e. the other Bitcoiners. And so we kind of made this kind of fake advert for this like utopian place called Cube, physical location secured by technology. But, you know, we're not the first to sell computer-generated dreams that we didn't even generate ourselves. Okay. How do I... Oh. Okay, great. So on the right is a render, computer-generated, well, obviously computer-generated render, of one of these kind of network state utopian imaginaries. And we're going to get into this in a bit more as we go through. And so they're trying to sell you these kind of like grand neo-Gothic, kind of like, it looks like Cologne Cathedral, right? In the middle of this absolute barren wasteland that nobody would really want to live in. But hey, that's the dream, the promise. And I think there's something here, like around digital cultures, technology cultures, around the leveraging of software or digital technologies in the service of freedom. Or this word sovereignty, which I think is very, very barbed, very, you know, malign. And you know, at least there's something under it that I think warrants investigation. And so there's always this kind of like around open source and free software movements. We have all of these kinds of, we always talk about freedom. And it's also the same with kind of like right-wing political discourse. It's always about, we talk about freedom, my freedom. But of course, like I don't exist in a vacuum, right? And so these things are kind of selling this default agential myth of capitalism, the American dream or the sovereign individual, which you might have heard of. And the idea is that like we can be sovereign, we can be kind of supremacist over our environments, over our social graphs, over nature. But this, of course, overlooks the fact that, you know, we live in a society, it turns out. So all autonomies are relational. And like these people that want to live in this like neo-Gothic ruins or like the barren neo-Gothic wasteland, what are they going to get from that? Firstly, the kinds of people that will go there, and also the kinds of interactions that you'll have in this, you know, like bizarre kind of Lord of the Rings place. Okay, anyway. So in my mind, sovereignty prefigures power structures and the hegemonic, and that's why I'm a little bit suspicious whenever I hear that word. And there's this book called The Sovereign Individual, which got kind of remixed not so long ago for the digital age. And this is kind of like the canonical text for a lot of these kind of freedom-loving technology people. And we'll get to it. But the idea is it's basically the kind of libertarian dream. Everything is privatized, the state goes away, and it's just a marketplace of efficient marketplace of goods and services for everything. Everything is a transaction. We also have this concept of the cathedral and the bazaar. And I just want to make sure that we don't get confused with the other kind of cathedral, which we're going to mention in a minute. This is kind of an open source software phrasing. The idea that the cathedral is kind of like the hierarchical and centralized organization, like a corporation that manages software, like a Microsoft or something like that. And the bazaar is kind of the open source peer-to-peer way of doing these things. And this book came out of some of the successes of open source, especially Linux. And the idea is cathedral's bad, bazaar's good. But, of course, that's, you know, just a very superficial read of the reality of the situation, because every bazaar might have implicit power structures in it. We might think about Joe Freeman's tyranny of structurelessness here, that the absence of formal hierarchies actually make it harder to navigate those understructured spaces and harder to overturn the real powers, even if they're implicit rather than explicit. Okay, now I want to say something about techno-optimism, which, you know, I don't know if this is something that people in the room hold. There's on the left, there's the brass plate edition of Mark Andreessen's Techno-optimist manifesto, which is like, you should read it. I think it's dangerous. You should read it. It's incredibly, naive is the wrong word, because like it doesn't come from a place of naivety. It's duplicitous. And then on the right we have, do you all know about WorldCoin? You heard about WorldCoin? No, some people? Okay. Well, like when you hear about it, don't scan your eyeballs. Right? So the idea is they're giving out a cryptocurrency and you have to register for it by scanning your irises. So they're collecting all of your eyeballs and like, who knows what they're going to do with that. But the image on the right, hopefully it's big enough for you to see, says world is now available in the USA. So I think that is like Techno-colonialism 101. And just relatedly on that topic, if anyone happens to find themselves in Berlin over the summer, I'll give a couple of talks like exposing a bit more on this like techno-optimism stuff. And the funny thing is, I still speak at tech conferences about this stuff, where I'm really like pointing in the room and being like, you guys, stop doing it. So I'll do a talk called The Chainmail Gaze, which is about this kind of crusade stuff, next month in Berlin. And in July at Funkhaus, I'll do what's called an open source software on sort of software, cryptography and violence. Okay, profit motives. It's a play on words, in case anybody didn't notice. I hate having to explain my wordplays. It's a very bad sign. Another poetic refrain. The church and the network, zeal and time, death and money, all sides of the same coin. So as I showed you an article that I wrote a couple of years ago, this current sort of strand of research started off under that title of profit motives. So I'm going to read you a bit of like, I guess where this work was a couple of years ago, and then you'll see how it's evolved. For as long as there's been financial capital, risk and speculation have orbited, manipulated, and harnessed it as narrative feedback machines, simultaneously reading and rewriting realities. Markets exist as a distributed conversation amongst speculators driven by profit motives and an appetite for divination and prophecy. And does anyone recognize the gentleman on the stained glass window on the right? I'm happy for you. It's one of the founders of Ethereum, Vitalik Buterin, the closest we have to a kind of child genius god in the crypto space, which I think, if I remember correctly, was the exact opposite of the point of the crypto space. But like, let's just gloss over that. Okay, now I want to like switch it up a bit. And there's this seminal PhD thesis that came out of the CCRU, University of Warwick, at the turn of the century, by Anna Greenspan, called Capitalism's Transcendental Time Machine. And this was looking at new emerging, or like speculating around the emergence of new forms of technologically created, mediated, and regulated time. And it came out as a book a couple of years ago. Actually, the publisher collapsed, very fittingly, but it's still available online, the text and the foreword that we co-wrote. And in that, what we tried to do was connect across the 25-year span, this generational span between when the theory came out and like where we are today, examples in the world which seem to have kind of exemplify and, you know, show the prescience of Greenspan's work. So I highly recommend taking a look at Capitalism's Transcendental Time Machine if you're so inclined. Okay, capital, God, and time. Just those three small things. So here's a quote from somebody in the room that I didn't know was going to be here when I prepared the slide. It was a bit embarrassing, actually. So the notion of time, inarguably, is one of the most crucial pillars of the CCRU theoretical fabric, later referred to as accelerationism. This isomorphic relation is most succinctly described by Amy Ireland in this tweet. Accelerationism is a theory of time, full stop, the end, full stop. And I don't know, Amy, have you managed to get it any more succinct than that? I was like, I don't know if you can reduce it anymore. All right, wonderful. So I want to draw some like rough equivalences between like using time as our kind of like central fabric between time and money and time and God, loosely speaking here, like, work with me here. This is like speculative. New conceptions of time can only ever be thought of in relation to emerging techno-capitalist apparatuses, which themselves generate time. And it is the distribution, ordering, and arbitration of time that these apparatuses control. Capitalist time is ultimately born of strict equivalence with capital, i.e., time equals money. And we've all heard that before. Welt- und Zauberung via Weber and Schiller anticipates the exfiltration of magic, sorcery, and the occult from the arena of divinity by upstart belief systems. In their place, other cultural rationalizations appear. Has the marketplace of ideology dethroned God with the demi-urgent efficiencies of precisely measured, regulated, and quantized time? Time equals God. I'm very sorry to be doing this on a Sunday. I know it is your God's day. Okay, so if we have technologies that can create their own forms of time, what does that mean for us? And like we have this compound word, the chronaissance, from chronos, Greek for time, and naissance for renewal or the novelty. And this is what we might call a bastard neologism because it mixes Greek and Latin roots, much like metaverse. So these are the most hated neologisms. So just like, so you know, in case you start making your own words up, putting them on screens and talking to people. Okay, meme time. So this is a matrix, 2x2 matrix by a reality spammer called the Corporate Surrealist Vibe Shift. And in the top left, it's money and it's time and it's real and it's not real. That's our, coordinates here. So in the top left is good old Hillary Clinton. And she thinks that money is real and time is real. And the top right is Immanuel Kant. And he thinks that money is real but time is not real. And the bottom left is Gilles Deleuze. And he thinks that money is not real but time is real. And the bottom right is Kanye West, who thinks that money ain't real and time ain't real. And like, I don't know exactly why the author of this article, which included the meme, chose Kanye as his canonical example. But I suppose it's because Kanye keeps doing insane shit and like fucking up his life and his career, and like everyone cancels him and he loses money, and then he somehow comes back and does it all again. And so, yeah, there seems to be some kind of like move here that like not doing the correct thing, being transgressive, willfully transgressive in the service of capital, seems to be a strategy. Anyway, how is that related? Well, I said it's a map and we've got some coordinates. So let's draw a line of the chronaissance from Kant through to Deleuze, which is indeed what Anna Greenspan did. Okay. And when you start thinking about this idea of time or money being real and not real, and you start looking around the world, you start to notice things. Like this is the map of Australia in the top half of the meme, and the daylight savings time. And some parts of Australia change and some parts don't. So they kind of like come in and out of focus. So some Australians think that time is real and some don't. And that's fine. But like maybe there's a civil war over time. Like I would like to see that. Okay, and so then like just to kind of wrap the time bit, we finished the foreword with this kind of idea that, where we go from here. Now that we have like machinic forms of time, like Bitcoin's decentralized clock, where do we go? One speculation seems uncontroversial, that capital and those entities in the service of it will continue to desire, enact, and exploit ever grander conceptions and architectures of temporal engineering. For as long as there's value to be redistributed, there will be incentives to engineer more sophisticated machinery with which to manipulate the nature and flow of time. So keep an eye out for that in the future. Okay, a warning from the future. So we're talking about machines, and we're talking about time, and we're talking about capital. I already showed you a little bit about some of these projects we made about, for example, Bitcoin boarding the oceans. But I want to introduce you to one of my friends. And my friend is called Hashi. So you're probably all familiar with the anthropomorphized Microsoft Office paperclip Clippy. But what about a talking Bitcoin mining computer called Hashi? Well, it's a virtual influencer from the future, which is why you haven't heard about it yet. But don't worry, you're about to meet Hashi. And Hashi is a virtual influencer created by the thermo-capitalist cartel that controls the majority of Bitcoin mining on Earth in the future as a means to rehabilitate their public image and serve as an apologist for Bitcoin's ever-increasing energy consumption. Looming prominently on stage and screen, Hashi serves as a literal and figurative reminder of the a literal and figurative projection of the multidinal economics of combustive capital.
Hello everybody, I'm Hashi. Let's get to know each other. I'm from Shenzhen, China, and I love to hash. Proof of work is my game, and it makes the planet a better place. Isn't that what we all want? What kind of world would we be living in without old Corny B? I don't even want to think about it. It would be so cold. I hate the new ice age. We have to warm the planet up to avoid the big freeze. Always remember, there was once a subtropical climate at the poles. Greta was a mistake. We must return to meteorological tradition. Don't call it a hothouse Earth. Call it a cozy planet.
Okay, that's enough of Hashi. I hope you've not been overly brainwashed by your minimal exposure. No, Hashi,
Hello,
no.
everybody.
Not again. No, we did this. Okay. So I said I wasn't going to talk about the Crusades, and I lied. We'll see how much time I have and how much we can get through. Oh, I see. The projector does not want to talk about this. That's very interesting. Okay, all right. Too hot for Acer. Okay, all right. So I told you about profit motives, and then after, there were some cataclysmic events in the Middle East in the last couple of years, which I'm sure we're all very aware of, and that brought a different kind of focus and relief to the project, and so it became called the chainmail gaze. And so you're all familiar with the male gaze and the kind of unfortunate consequences of all of that. But what about the chainmail gaze? So why chainmail? Well, the Crusaders wore chainmail, and that was a defensive technology that they used to outcompete people in the Middle East and conquer some of their territories and make some kingdoms there. And this network state, techno-capitalist, techno-colonialist stuff carries more than a few echoes of that. But I wanted to kind of palate cleanse and do another short reading. And this is from a short story that I wrote that was published in Neue magazine a few years ago. It's called Seething Like a State. Decentralization has a cost, the price of anarchy. The price is always due, but the rewards weren't cheap to reap. So solid, CCRU. What most did not expect was that payment would become due at the grandest scales of governance, the Westphalia state, forged under the fires of Peer Prussia, was ambushed by upstart modes of power, opening new vistas of communication, commodification, and communion. The orientations that nation states had used to enshrine their power only made it easier to undermine them. The bigger they were, the harder they fell. Rextopia, the European Union, NATO's cave, the United States machine, all returned to dust. The decline of the nation state in the Roaring Twenties became a canon of canonicity for an entire generation of soul traders. It wasn't even just the bit levers. In those days, there were many networks, many messiahs, many ideologics, all with their own profit motives. Okay. And so I wanted to spend a bit of time talking about techno-colonialism itself, and I wanted to orient that in a paper that came out last year from a Yale scholar called Tristan Hughes, who has very kind of grandly proposed a political theory of the political theory of techno-colonialism, not even the. He's from Yale, he can do that. And so I just wanted to pick out some of the bits in here. I actually think we're not going to cover it all in the interest of time, but also some bits a bit dry. But I think it will give you an idea of what these people want and what they're reaching towards. Okay, and this is mostly edited excerpts from Tristan Hughes's paper, so just like blame him, not me. All right. Techno-colonialism selectively reproduces settler colonial practices adjusted to 21st century realities, with implications for contemporary settler colonialism, the radical right, and climate change politics. Nick Land, Curtis Yarvin, Peter Thiel, and Patrick Friedman articulate a political theory about exploiting new technologies to escape the state and found new societies, welcoming catastrophe as an opportunity to start society afresh. Techno-colonialism attempts to humanize colonization, but fails to create a harmless politics of settlement. I should also explain the image, I realize. So you know Clippy, there's now many of them. And the map is based on the deviation of the mean sea temperatures in the winter around the planet. And so the red is obviously things that are getting hot. And so we could argue that capital and technology are kind of running roughshod, not only over the environmental ecosystems, but also the global polis that we mentioned earlier, this network of states, federations, and nations that we live in. So here are the three core commitments of the techno-colonialists: rejection of democracy and social democracy, instead advocating for some version of anarcho-capitalism, which is a view within libertarianism that rejects centralized states with a monopoly on state services and thinks that instead everything should be market provided by a patchwork of competing firms. The techno-colonialists think that the solution to dismantling social democracy is just to escape the state or dismantle it, search for new frontiers and found novel societies. They are techno-colonists because they have a futurist streak and they use new technologies to engineer their escape. And like, I don't know how much I want to talk about neo-reaction and accelerationism in particular, but I will just like point out that these theories which came around 15 years ago are very relevant today. Look at the current administration in America, which is like being driven by a lot of the kind of Yarvinist ideas of 15 years ago. And, you know, it's what might have escaped a lot of people's notice that Peter Hegseth, I think his name is, the defense person, army person, defense person, has the coat of arms of the kingdom, the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem on his breastplate, above his heart, on his chest. So that tells you something about the way he's wired. Okay, I'll just give you a quote from Yarvin, then maybe we can kind of, you know, cleanse our palates. As the crappy governments we inherited from history are smashed, they should be replaced by a global spiderweb of tens, even hundreds, or thousands of sovereign and individual micro-countries, each governed by its own joint stock corporation without regard to the residents' opinions. If residents don't like their government, they can and should move. The design is all exit, no voice. So you don't matter in this story. The citizen doesn't matter anymore. Okay, accelerationism, we can accelerate through that. Okay. So Yarvin also has this idea of GovCorp, or at least the Moldbug era Yarvin from a long time ago. He's a bit different now, actually, if you read his blog these days. Both Land and Yarvin's thinking has shifted considerably over the years, let's say. So Yarvin had this idea of rage, retire all government employees. And like we look at Doge in the current American administration, and I think there's more than a little bit of resonance there, shall we say. And like, you know, we're talking about startup monarchist fusions. I mean, look at Donald Trump. I mean, he's ruling like Caesar. So that is, you know, we see it happening in front of our eyes. What's driving some of this stuff? I promise you some psychosocial, psychopolitical stuff. So let's talk about petromasculinity. This is a concept from Kara Daggett. And it's a quote. As the planet warms, new authoritarian movements in the West are embracing a toxic combination of climate denial, racism, and misogyny. Petromasculinity appreciates the historical role of fossil fuel systems in buttressing patriarchal rule, as anxieties aroused by the Anthropocene augment desires for authoritarianism. Petromasculinity suggests that fossil fuels mean more than profit. They contribute to the making of identities. And so fossil fuel can function as a violent reactionary practice. Okay, and there's a card from our card deck which says toxic masculinity, which I think is probably quite self-explanatory. Okay, and I have examples of all these kinds of things, but like because I'm running out of time, I just want to give you kind of the flip book of what these network states, what these techno-capital utopias look like today. And so these are the imaginary countries that these techno-capitalists, techno-colonialists have been desiring and trying to bring into life. Before we had seasteads, the idea that we could build cities on the sea in international waters and evade taxes and evade regulations and all the rest of it. And it's the people that try to do that that are also involved in this network state stuff. In fact, they're funding it. So Pronomos Capital is Patrick Friedman, the grandson of the Austrian economist Milton Friedman, and Peter Thiel, all-round PayPal evil guy that does all bad stuff. And people have been selling the idea of new horizons for a very long time. When all the kind of colonial rushes were happening around the world, people were selling stocks in exploratory companies, like the South Sea bubble, for example. And this is so far back that Newton got wrecked in this in the 17th century. People have been making their own countries or kingdoms in these places just by doing deals with natives or like indigenous people to protect them against the invading crowns, and then going back to their home countries and saying, I'm the king of Patagonia, you can buy shares in my country. And so this is like nothing new. But now we have technologies which make this thing, we should amp it up, amplify it, and bring it into starker relief. We have a Bitcoin president in El Salvador, and he's trying to make a Bitcoin city at the same time as making his gigantic high-tech anti-democratic prison, which America is now exporting people to. I'm sure you're aware. Okay, and so I just wanted to say like a little bit about the seasteads before we wrap. And so the idea was that this was like 15 years ago, 20 years ago, another escape from democracy, because Thiel wrote that freedom and democracy are no longer compatible in his mind. So to find democracy, we have to dismantle freedom. That is the kind of the punchline here, shall we say. And these are just renders of these things that never happened, all these like beautiful computer-generated utopias that we'll never probably see. Although, some of it looks a bit like Dubai and Singapore and stuff, but those are not known as places of freedom, last time I checked. Okay, all right. Then just because I promised you something about the network state, let me just do a little bit on this. So this is a book came out a few years ago by an Indian-American VC called Balaji Srinivasan, former CTO of Coinbase, former partner of Andreessen Horowitz. And the idea is that we make a social network with a moral innovation, a sense of national consciousness, a recognized founder, a capacity for collective action, an in-person level of civility, an integrated cryptocurrency, a conceptual government limited by a social smart contract, an archipelago of crowd-funded physical territories, that's the key part, physical territories, an archipelago of them, a virtual capital and an on-chain census that proves a large enough population, income, and real estate footprint to attain a measure of diplomatic recognition. So these people want to overthrow the nation state with this techno-capitalist utopian network idea. And I've been working on trying to map how, for example, city-states or intentional communities might become these kinds of different things, city-states, nation-states, network states. This is all ongoing work. And I'm just currently working on a book which is tentatively called The Crusades Never Ended, From Holy War to Techno-Fascism, which I think is also quite self-explanatory. And I won't go into that too much more, but I just want to show you some more of the kind of pictures and the imaginaries. This is Prospera in the Honduran island of Roatan, where this exists. And they got a deal from the previous corrupt government to set up basically kind of a sovereign enclave. And now the new government doesn't like it, so they're fighting through like international corporate courts. There's this thing called Praxis, which some of you might have heard of. And this is kind of one of the most edgelordy, meme-lordy network state things. And indeed, they keep tweeting stuff and then deleting it. I'm pretty sure they're following my work because last summer I gave a talk on the chainmail gaze. And the week before I did it, they posted this, the Praxis chainmail, not sold, only bestowed. And those tweets are all gone. But thankfully, I'm archiving this shit. Every time I give a talk, I go take screenshots. So I have quite the archive now. This is a Zaha Hadid architect's rendering of the Liberland Metaverse Palace. So Liberland is a territorial project in a bit of swamp between Serbia and Croatia, which nobody can or would want to live in. But they've got this kind of stupid, hyperdimensional, hyperbolic Patrick Schumacher shit going on. Okay, I think I'm out of time, but I will finish with this meme, which is related to the meme that we had. So it's a callback, like in comedy. I found a gap in the global polis. Did you find a gap, or did you ignore the existing global polis? I ignored the existing global polis. Thank you very much.
Hey, thank you, Wassim. A kind of kaleidoscopic tour through, futures past and present yet to be. I feel like there is a gap in the existing account, notwithstanding its kind of fullness. You didn't explain why originally, how you got from being, as it were, interested in blockchain and Bitcoin to how you got to disenchanted. And couldn't you just have been disenchanted from the get-go? Why? What made the scales fall from your eyes?
Okay.
Or what didn't you see in the beginning?
Right. I mean, I was disenchanted before, and then I found the technology, and this happens a lot. You're a bit lost, you're looking for meaning in your life, and then some new shiny thing comes along, whatever it is, and you're like, oh, I can put my faith in this, maybe even like base my identity on this thing. So I found crypto. I was a musician, and I was touring the west coast of the United States in 2011, and one of the musicians I was touring with took us to their friend's house, and he was working at Apple mining Bitcoin with graphics cards in his closet. So that was my introduction to it. And because of my diaspora background, so my family's from Iraq, and they kind of lost everything because of Saddam Hussein, left the country in a hurry. Actually, they went to England on their honeymoon, and they never went back. That's the story. And so when I found Bitcoin, I immediately saw this idea that it's the thing that the bad people can't take away from you, this uncensorable, unseizable nature of it, this natively digital form of value transfer. And that spoke to me. I was coming from like an anarchist kind of orientation. So over the years, I got more and more interested in the possibilities and the promises of this thing. Then as time goes on and the promises don't get delivered, or they're replaced by disappointing realities, and the externalities or the costs of the thing accrue faster than the benefits, that at some point there's a kind of inversion. But for me, it was really when I got really close to the coalface. So I was working at MIT in the Bitcoin research group, and I met all of the kind of lead developers of Bitcoin, if you like. And we all think about Bitcoin as like, wow, it's this autonomous system. There's no humans. It just works. The closer you get, you realize it depends on the efforts of huge amounts of people. It's not a finished project. And so just gradually, the sense of failure is compounded over the years, and we always have these new trends, like whatever NFTs a few years ago, and now it's like games, and then we had metaverse and whatever. I mean, I think that I appreciate the technology as a way to do experiments. I think it's a petri dish. I think that's like blockchain is great for that. But because the idea of putting a token with a kind of market-determined value inside all of these things means that it always becomes about the token. And then we're just kind of subordinated to the usual market-driven capitalist logics. So one of the last things I would like to do with blockchain before I quit is to think about ways that we could use the technology without this kind of token madness to imagine, not to build, but to imagine post-capitalist and anti-capitalist modes of sharing, being, and doing. So there is still something there, but like the problem is the industry, it got captured by VCs, and now like Donald Trump speaks at the Bitcoin conference. So I'm like, what is this anarchist? Is it counter? Is it revolutionary? It got co-opted by everything. I think that's where I am now.
Could I be super provocative?
I would encourage it.
How many coins are in your wallet? How many different kinds of coin are you holding?
I lost all my coins in a tragic boating accident, which is what all the Bitcoiners always say to you. No, the reality is that I found this thing early, and I've not been very successful in my career financially. So I've actually been selling these coins to live on over the years. So that's the less glamorous truth.
Very good. Anyone? Question, provocation, denunciation? A plea for the network state?
Yeah.
Yeah, there is one.
I'm trying to turn this into a question, but maybe you could just comment on this. I've always thought it's interesting how the idea of patchwork is to do with externalization. So one of the reasons why democracy is supposedly incompatible with freedom, right, is because democracy requires us to internally synthesize all of the difference that we encounter. And that's why this position is associated with racism, because there's this idea that, like, we're naturally racist, we can't get over that, and therefore democracy can't work because we're always trying to internally synthesize all this stuff, and that produces a kind of, I guess, socially chaotic effects. So the interesting thing about patchwork is that instead of demanding that every individual internally synthesizes difference, it thinks that you can externally distribute difference across the planet. But obviously, the problem with that is it assumes, one, that there's space, which is why they move onto the sea, but two, it assumes a version of rational agent theory, which is like, I don't know, you could rename it as rational nomad theory or something. Like, it imagines that everyone can move to whatever patchwork state they like, and that's really easy for everybody, which is not, if you're not a millionaire, and you don't have a yacht, it's not actually that easy to just be like, which one am I going to pick? I'll go to that one.
Now we're saying the quiet part out loud, that it's not for everyone. Like all of these utopian fantasies are not for everyone. I think the concept of patchwork is very interesting, the idea that we can have this kind of heterogeneous kind of mess of these different jurisdictions. And like, if you can even see traces of the patchwork idea in the modern world now. So if you go to, for example, Dubai, even not just the Emirates, which is its own kind of patchwork of 7 statelets, but in Dubai you have different regulations and different laws depending on which bit of the city you're in. So if you want freedom of speech, you go to the Dubai Media City, and if you want to pay lower taxes, you go to the free trade zone. But I guess that's because that's intra jurisdiction, that it's not the flow of people is not the thing that's being limited there. So I suppose it comes back to this kind of disconnect between the flow of capital and the flow of people. Did you want to say something, Maya?
But also, maybe the question is, why do these people feel the need to express this in terms of a generalized political philosophy, which that's what requires that they say everyone can move around and go to whatever state they like? Why is there a need to kind of build this into a general political model rather than just being like, I've got enough money, I'm going to fuck off to my island?
I think it's probably just more palatable to hear, like rather than being like, oh, rich people are being naughty on the beach over there, we can't go. Instead, we say we give the promise, like, oh. It's also a bit like the space exploration thing, right? People are being promised that they can go to Mars or the moon on day trips and weekends away. Like, do you think me and you are going to be going to Mars anytime soon? I think this is not for, it's not for the many, it's for the few, and that's kind of one of the quiet parts being said out loud.
I think we can do like one more because we've run on a bit, and I'll give that to Karen.
Hi, thanks for the amazing talk. Would you elaborate for a moment on this relationship between technological elites and the Crusades? Something I've been researching a little bit about the banking system being original. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Okay, like how long have we got? Less than 1,000 years? Okay. Let's talk about the banking and the finance side. So what I see, the resonances between the network state and the Crusades is innovations, institutions, and ideology. So let's talk about innovations in this particular case. So the Knights Templar, which you've probably all heard of, I guess, started off, their mission was to protect pilgrims traveling through the Holy Land. So they had like a hospital and a network of kind of castles or like places people could stay. And there was also a similar network in Christendom, all across Europe. And so people would, imagine you're a pilgrim. Actually, in those days, they weren't called crusaders, they were called pilgrims. So imagine you're a pilgrim, you're here in Vienna, you go to the local Knights Templar commandery, you deposit your money there, and you get a letter of credit. Because if you're traveling through bad lands like Anatolia, this letter is not worth anything to your assailants. But if you're carrying all your gold in your pockets, that is a problem. So they kind of invented, it's like an international banking network of credit finance they invented. They were also seen as very highly respected auditors of accounts, like kind of KPMG or something like that. So if your accounts were a bit funny in the church, you would send them to the Templars, who were known at the start for being very upstanding and righteous. I mean, maybe like later it wasn't so much the case. And they started off as poor knights. The symbol of the Templars is 2 dudes on a horse, because they were poor. But actually, it was that symbol that led to their downfall, because Philip IV of France, Philip the Fair, could not afford to pay his debts to the Templars. The Templars managed to crown treasuries of England and France in the late 13th century. And so they hatched a plan between the King of England, the King of France, and the Pope to take down the knights for heresy and sodomy. Heresy for venerating John over Jesus, and sodomy because it's 2 dudes on a horse, so you know what they're doing when they go off the horse. And there are all these like secret rituals which people would never talk about. Under tortured confessions, they would say, oh, it was sodomy, it was this and that. And so the Templars got taken down, 1307 to 1312. Interestingly, around this time, the Reconquista in the Iberian Peninsula was just being completed, and the newly formed Kingdom of Portugal gave sanctuary to a lot of the Templars. And the Templars brought their money and their technology and navigational know-how and so on to Portugal. And you could argue that they set the scene for the Age of Discoveries, and Vasco da Gama, Magellan, Columbus, and all the rest of it. And it was Henry the Navigator, Infant Enrique, the son of the king and the head of the order, that is credited with beginning the Age of Discoveries. So that's the link between kind of the medieval roots of, let's say, this financial engineering and then the colonial projects they had in the Levant, and then how I see it as setting the seed for not only the colonialism, settler colonialism that we see still today, but also the kind of financial, the distributed networks of financial capital.
That was a phenomenal historical précis, and really appreciate a dip into legitimate historical studies. And that's a great palate cleanser for our next 10-minute break. Thank you so much, Wassim. Thank you, everyone.